I suspect many of you know the answer to this question, but I still find that many people are surprised by it. What animal do you think kills the most humans each year? Now, if you said sharks, well, you're way off. Shark Week is an exaggeration. Sharks only kill about 6 people a year. In fact, elephants kill more than 80 times that, an average of more than 500 people a year, which puts elephants on par with hippopotamuses. Dogs do kill a couple of tens of thousands of people a year, mostly because they bring rabies, and snakes kill as many as 100,000. But what about people? I mean, people are animals, and people do kill people. According to the United Nations, there are an average of more than 430,000 homicides every year. But even then, people aren't even close to the animal that kills the most people. No, that distinction belongs to the mosquito. The diminutive, blood-sucking bringer of disease kill, according to research done by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as many as 2 million people a year. Mosquitoes bring illnesses like malaria, yellow fever, dengue fever, Zika virus, West Nile virus, and a host of others that are either deadly or debilitating. And knowing how deadly they are and understanding that at any given time there are an estimated 100 trillion mosquitoes on Earth, maybe it doesn't surprise you to find out that mosquitoes have played a significant role in war. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Only a small fraction of the more than 3,000 species of mosquito are dangerous to humans, all coming from just 3 of some 112 mosquito genera. And even then, the threat only comes from the females, who use their proboscis to pierce skin and drink blood in order to acquire protein and iron needed to produce eggs. Sometimes the female ingests pathogens in the process and then passes them on to the next person they bite. These pathogens include some of the deadliest illnesses in human history, with at least one estimate, although disputed, suggesting that nearly half the humans who have died throughout human history were killed by mosquito-borne illnesses, extrapolating some 52 billion human deaths due to mosquitoes. More conservative estimates are 1/10 of that, or merely that mosquitoes have killed only 1 in 20 people who have ever lived. The story of how humans, mosquitoes, and the diseases that mosquitoes carry interact is a vast, important story. It has affected migration and civilizations and settlement. And mosquitoes have been implicated in at least contributing to the deaths of Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, and Oliver Cromwell. Mosquito-borne illnesses killed at least 7 popes, and 8 U.S. presidents have suffered from malaria. Today is September 13th, and an important person was born on this day in history. On September 13th, 1851, Walter Reed was born in Gloucester County, Virginia. You might have heard the name Walter Reed as the name of a U.S. military hospital near Washington, D.C. Walter Reed, after whom the hospitals were named, did many things, but he is most famous as an Army doctor for identifying the connection between mosquitoes and yellow fever, although Reed himself gave much of the credit to Cuban epidemiologist Carlos Finley. In 1904, the United States took control of a failed French effort to build a canal across Panama. The French effort had largely been undermined by tropical diseases, which devastated the workforce. 13 of the original 30 French engineers on the project died of yellow fever. U.S. Army Dr. William Crawford Gorgas became Chief Sanitary Officer at the canal and, leveraging the discoveries of Reed and Finley, instituted a sanitary program, a war on mosquitoes that included the draining of ponds and swamps, fumigation, use of mosquito netting, and construction of public water systems. By significantly reducing the incidence of tropical disease among the workforce, Gorgas is credited with having made the canal possible. While the strategic purpose of the Panama Canal has decreased in a time when the U.S. Navy is built around large aircraft carriers that are too large to traverse the canal, that wasn't always the case. In fact, there's a strong argument to say that the primary purpose in building the canal wasn't as much economic as it was military. The Panama Canal was seen as a central part of American strategy to achieve naval dominance in the early part of the 20th century. During the Second World War, the canal played a vital strategic role as both a deterrent to the Axis by giving the U.S. the ability to bring naval assets to bear quickly anywhere in the world, and to shorten lines of supply and troop transport. The U.S. built significant fortifications to protect the canal, and there was at least one German plot to try to cripple the canal by bringing dive bombers to the Caribbean via submarine. And the strategic importance of the canal continued well into the 20th century. The Chicago Tribune notes that during the Vietnam War, fully 90% of the ammunition used by U.S. troops was transported on vessels that had transited the canal. Simply put, the linchpin of U.S. war strategy for most of the 20th century depended first upon the war with mosquitoes. And that shouldn't be a surprise, because the interaction between mosquitoes and war actually goes back to antiquity. A February 2020 issue of the Science History Institute gives some examples. The numbers are astonishing. 35% of European crusaders were killed by mosquitoes. 84% of the British force that invaded Cartagena in 1727 died of yellow fever, and 85% of Horatio Nelson's troops in Nicaragua succumbed to dengue, yellow fever, and malaria in 1780. During the Spanish-American War, only 379 American servicemen were killed in combat, but 4,700 died of mosquito-borne disease. Referring to the genus Anopheles, the mosquitoes that carry malaria, military historian Timothy Weingard writes in his 2020 book, Mosquito, A Human History of Our Deadliest Predator, with reckless abandon, General Anopheles raised armies and decided the outcome of countless course-altering wars. The effect of the mosquito was one of the reasons that Rome became so powerful. The swamps surrounding Rome and their mosquitoes were a barrier to foreign invaders. Some historians argue that malaria was a primary reason that Hannibal chose not to attack Rome after his victory in the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, and that Attila the Hun left Italy without attacking Rome in 452 in order to avoid the malaria outbreaks that commonly started in northern Italy in the fall. The mosquitoes may even have protected Rome in defeat. When Alaric, king of the Visigoths, sacked Rome in 410, he died only a few months later of a fever that many historians conclude was most likely malaria, an illness to which Alaric and his Germanic Visigoths, coming from lands where mosquitoes and malaria were not present, would not have developed natural defense. But there might be a grand historical irony. Based on historical descriptions and DNA isolated by researchers at the University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology from the remains of a Roman child dated to 450 AD, some historians hypothesize that a particularly virulent form of malaria was striking Rome in the 5th century. That is, the same swamps that protected the city for centuries might have led to a mosquito-borne pestilence that hastened the downfall of the Western Roman Empire. And if mosquitoes played a role in the downfall of the Roman Empire, they also played a critical role in the rise of the American Republic. Aedes aegypti, one of the small number of mosquito species particularly dangerous to humans, came to the Americas as part of the Columbian Exchange, quite likely coming on the ships of the Atlantic slave trade. Ironically, the disease-carrying pests were particularly dangerous to Europeans, devastating European colonies in the tropics, and those same mosquitoes would aid the Americans in the War for Independence. After the failure of the Saratoga campaign, the British decided to pursue the war in the South, beginning in 1778 with the capture of Savannah, Georgia. While there were different challenges involved in the British Southern strategy, one of the biggest was malaria. American troops were largely Southern natives, who, unlike the British under General Charles Cornwallis, were used to malaria epidemics, having developed some resistance. As American General Nathanael Greene carried on a strategy of avoidance and attrition, Cornwallis found his troops increasingly disabled by mosquito-borne illnesses, malaria and yellow fever. A 2016 edition of Smithsonian Magazine noted that, at times, half the British Army was too sick to move. Cornwallis called the illness the fatal sickness, which so nearly ruined the army. It was an attempt to avoid the epidemic, which at the time no one knew was transmitted by mosquitoes, that caused Cornwallis to retreat to Virginia. There, Cornwallis fortified the area around the Virginia village of Yorktown, where his troops would have access to the sea in case the Royal Navy needed to reinforce or evacuate them. But malaria struck his army again there. During the critical 1781 siege of Yorktown, more than half his troops were too sick to stand duty. His eventual October 1781 defeat in the siege of Yorktown was the decisive battle, the American Revolution. While both sides were affected, Smithsonian notes that the American and French forces had only come to Virginia recently, and many had experience with and resistance from tropical diseases, and thus stayed healthy throughout the battle. One of the more startling examples of the effect of mosquitoes on a military campaign was the 1809 Walcheren campaign, an attempt by the British to assist the Austrians against France during the War of the Fifth Coalition. The goal was to invade the Dutch island of Walcheren and capture the city of Antwerp. The British Army included some 40,000 soldiers who were facing a disorganized force of poor-quality French troops. And despite initial successes, the British force was quickly decimated by disease, most notably a debilitating recurring fever thought to be most likely malaria, although other diseases were also likely present as well. Approximately 4,000 British soldiers died from what was called Walcheren fever, and thousands more, some 40% of the invasion force, fell ill. The invasion, which included more troops than were fighting under Wellesley in the Peninsular Campaign, collapsed without achieving any of its objectives. Reportedly, Napoleon, whose own troops had suffered greatly from disease on the island, flooded the Dutch countryside in the hopes of causing the illness writing, "We must oppose the English with nothing but fever, which will soon devour them all." It is unlikely that Napoleon had any idea that these fevers were caused by mosquitoes that would breed in the water from the places that he had flooded. Rather, he most likely believed that the diseases and fevers came from the smell that emanated from swamps, which is the same thing that the Romans believed. In fact, the word malaria is derived from the Italian words mal-aria, meaning literally bad air. Mosquitoes as the vector for malaria wasn't proven until 1897, when British physician Ronald Ross confirmed the presence of the malarial parasite inside the gut of a mosquito, an achievement for which he was awarded the 1902 Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine. Mosquitoes and the illness that they bring also played a role in the U.S. Civil War. The mosquitoes were certainly an annoyance. In 1862, a correspondent for the New York Tribune accused mosquitoes of siding with the Confederacy, writing, "They must have strong secession sympathies. They certainly were bitter enemies of the Nationalists and phlebotomized them without mercy." But his complaint notwithstanding, they also victimized the rebels, with one Confederate soldier describing Mississippi River mosquitoes as preponderance size, almost able to shoulder a musket. Given the experience in the American Revolution, you might think that the mosquitoes would have favored the South, where the troops were more likely to be resistant. In fact, Gary Miller of Montana State University noted in a 1997 edition of American Entomologist that there are over 1.3 million cases and 10,000 deaths from malaria in the Union Army, and fully 1/4 of all illnesses reported in the Union Army were malarial in character. The Confederacy, while also affected, saw proportionally fewer cases, and Miller argues a malaria outbreak thwarted an 1862 attempt by the Federal Army to capture Vicksburg. However, in the end, the mosquitoes ended up aiding the boys in blue. Quinine, an extract of the South American cinchona tree, had originally been identified by Europeans in the 16th century, but it wasn't until it was isolated by French pharmacist Pierre Pelletier that it became widely available as an effective prophylactic for malaria. Because of the effectiveness of the Union blockade, the North had relative access to quinine, which was scarce in the South. While Southern doctors worked to create medicines for fever using native plants, they simply weren't as effective as quinine, which the North industrially manufactured. While a malaria outbreak contributed to the Union failure to capture Vicksburg in 1862, an outbreak among the Confederate Army in 1863 contributed to the final Union capture of the strategic port, giving them control of the lower Mississippi River. The website of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine writes, "One could argue the Confederate Army's struggle with the parasite was a contributing factor to the outcome of the war." And mosquito-borne illnesses continued to be a problem well into the 20th century. More than 1.5 million troops were infected with malaria during the First World War, and mosquito-borne illnesses continued to be an issue during the Second World War, where there was a lot of fighting in tropical zones. Mosquito-borne illnesses affected entire campaigns. For example, the Army Heritage Center Foundation notes that estimates from the Philippines in 1942 indicate that roughly 24,000 out of the 75,000 American and Filipino defenders were suffering from malaria at the time of the invasion. Given that the Japanese invasion force included only 57,000 troops, the loss of an entire division's worth of soldiers was significant. Malaria significantly affected both sides in the Vietnam War. Weingart notes that during peak mosquito season, North Vietnamese columns pouring down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, snaking through the jungles of Laos and Cambodia, reported malarial rates reaching 90%. Whereas on the American side, the website History.net explains, official and anecdotal evidence suggests that the anti-malarial pills distributed as a precaution may not have been worth much more than the insect repellent. In 1996, the director of the malaria program at the U.S. Naval Medical Research Institute said, "In every military campaign this century, we lost more casualties to malaria than bullets. During World War II and the Vietnam War, entire divisions ceased to be effective combat units due to malaria." After the Vietnam War, the United States developed an anti-malarial medication that's called mefloquine, which was developed at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. And while mefloquine is effective against malaria, it has been found to produce a risk of neuropsychiatric side effects, including anxiety, depression, hallucinations, acute psychosis, and seizures. In fact, doctors are worried that many soldiers that served in Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan are actually suffering from the side effects of mefloquine, and that it's being misdiagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. So many are suffering that some people have argued that the side effects of this anti-malarial medication are this generation's Agent Orange. And so, General Anopheles, even in the 21st century, continues to affect soldiers and civilians. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history. And if you did enjoy, feed the algorithm by making a comment or clicking that like button. If you have suggestions for future episodes, please send those to our suggestions email box. Check out our webpage at thehistoryguy.net. And of course, we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can book a special message from the History Guy on Cameo and check out our merchandise at teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes of Forgotten History, all you need to do is subscribe.